The candlelight flickered across the polished dinner table, casting warm shadows on the faces I thought I knew best. Claire, the dutiful 38-year-old nurse, had slaved over that meal roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the works for our weekly family gathering. Mom smiled sweetly as she passed the peas. Dad nodded approvingly at my sister Evelyn's latest tale of woe. Evelyn, the golden child, always the one who needed just a little more help. I sat there, fork in hand, oblivious to the storm brewing. Then it hit. "Claire, honey," Mom said, casually sipping her wine. "We need you to lend Evelyn your $5,000 savings. She deserves it, starting that business, you know." Dad chuckled as if it were a joke. "Yeah, kiddo, you've got your life together. Evelyn's the one who could use a boost." My heart plummeted. That money was my safety net, scraped together from endless shifts and skipped vacations. They laughed like it was pocket change, like I was just the family ATM. Humiliation burned in my chest, years of being the overlooked one, the sacrificer, boiling over in that moment. I didn't scream, didn't argue. I just stood chair scraping the floor like a final punctuation and walked out into the night. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing away their stunned silence. By morning, I'd changed the locks on my apartment and packed my bags for a fresh start. Now, Mom's calls flood my phone, panicked voicemails begging me to come back as if she senses the unraveling. But this is just the beginning. What if I told you this betrayal uncovers decades of lies, forged documents, and a family secret that shatters everything? Stick around, twists that will leave you gasping. A revenge so calculated it'll make your blood race, and a payoff that delivers pure, empowering satisfaction. You won't believe how it ends. My name is Claire Thompson, 38 years old, a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in suburban Ohio, and the daughter who always showed up. I've spent the last 15 years paying my own rent, putting myself through night school, and quietly tucking away every extra dollar into a savings account that finally touched $5,000. That money was my parachute, my proof that one day I could stop running on fumes. Tonight, though, I was running on hope, the hope that a simple family dinner would feel like belonging instead of bookkeeping. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and butter, the way it always did when I cooked for them. I'd driven the 40 minutes from my apartment with grocery bags in the trunk, and a smile I practiced in the rearview mirror. Mom had asked for something homey, so I'd brined the chicken, overnight peeled real potatoes instead of the boxed flakes Evelyn preferred, and even baked an apple pie because Dad still pretended fruit counted as dessert. The table was set with the good china, the one with the tiny blue forget-me-nots that Grandma left Mom when she passed. I told myself the effort mattered, that love could be measured in tablespoons of effort and degrees on a meat thermometer. They arrived at 6 sharp, the way they always did when someone else was cooking. Dad carried a bottle of the cheap red he bought by the case. Mom clutched a tin of store-bought cookies just in case. Evelyn swept in last phone in one hand, designer purse in the other, complaining about traffic on the highway she took every single day. She kissed the air near my cheek, then immediately launched into a story about her boss undervaluing her visionary ideas. I nodded, stirred the gravy, and felt the familiar tug. Claire the listener, Claire the fixer, Claire, who never made waves. We sat down in our usual places, Dad at the head, Mom to his right. Evelyn across from me so she could gesture freely, me at the foot because someone had to carve the bird. The first 10 minutes were easy, almost sweet. Dad complimented the crust on the chicken. Mom asked about my patience, genuinely interested for once. Evelyn dominated, of course, but I was used to that. I passed the potatoes, refilled water glasses, and let the warmth settle over me like a blanket. I thought this was why I kept coming back. Then Mom set her fork down with a soft clink that somehow cut through every other sound. "Claire, honey." She began the same tone she used when asking me to pick up Evelyn's dry cleaning or cover her phone bill just this once. Dad cleared his throat, a warning bell I'd learned to dread. Evelyn suddenly found her napkin fascinating. "We've been talking?" Mom continued, folding her hands like she was about to pray. Evelyn's ready to take the next step, really launch her consulting thing. "But startup costs, you know how it is." She smiled, bright and brittle. "We need you to lend her the $5,000 you've been saving. It's only fair. Your sister deserves it." The words landed between us like a dropped plate sharp, irreversible. I felt the heat rush to my face, not from the oven, but from the sudden, blinding clarity of what was happening. $5,000. Not a favor, not a discussion, a demand delivered with the casual certainty that I would comply because I always had. Dad chuckled a low rumble meant to ease tension. "You're doing fine, kiddo. Evelyn's the one who needs the leg up." Evelyn finally looked up, eyes wide with practiced innocence. "It's not like I'm asking for a handout, Claire. It's an investment. In family." She reached for the pie as if the conversation were already settled, as if my life's cushion were nothing more than seed money for her latest scheme. I stared at my plate. The chicken had gone cold. The gravy congealed into a skin I couldn't bring myself to break. Memories flashed uninvited, the Christmases I'd worked double shifts so Evelyn could have the designer coat. The vacation fund I'd drained when her car needed tires. The student loans I'd paid alone while Mom co-signed Evelyn's business classes that never led anywhere. Every sacrifice, every swallowed protest crystallized in that moment. They weren't asking. They were taking. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist, was the laughter. Dad's easy guffaw, Mom's indulgent smile, Evelyn's smug little smirk. To them, my savings were disposable because I was. The room tilted. I heard my pulse in my ears louder than the ticking of the old wall clock Grandma used to wind every Sunday. I set my fork down carefully, the metal cool against my trembling fingers. No one noticed. They were already moving on Mom, asking Evelyn about color schemes for her non-existent office, Dad pouring more wine. I pushed my chair back. The scrape against the hardwood sounded final like a judge's gavel. Claire Mom's voice floated after me, puzzled but not alarmed. She expected me to fetch dessert to smooth things over with coffee and apologies. I didn't answer. My legs carried me through the dining room past the framed photos where Evelyn's graduation portrait took center stage, and my nursing pin was relegated to a side table. The front door was heavier than I remembered, or maybe my hands were shaking too hard to turn the knob cleanly. Cool night air slapped my face as I stepped onto the porch. Behind me, their voices rose in confusion, then laughter again, as if my exit were the punchline to a joke I'd never been in on. I walked to my car keys, cutting into my palm. The streetlights blurred through sudden tears I refused to let fall. $5,000. My future. My freedom. Gone in a sentence, justified by a smile. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing like eyes that had never truly seen me. That night they thought they robbed me, but they only freed me. The engine was still warm when I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, the same one I'd lived in for 8 years, without ever hanging a picture on the walls. I sat in the driver's seat long after the headlights dimmed, staring at the faint glow from the second-floor window that was mine. The night air pressed against the glass, thick with the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke from someone else's Saturday. My hands stayed locked at 10 and 2 knuckles white, as if letting go would mean admitting I had nowhere else to steer. The silence inside the car felt louder than the dinner table had ever been, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't rush to fill it. I don't know how long I stayed there, minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually the dashboard clock blinked, 9:47, and the absurdity of it snapped me out of the trance. I grabbed my purse, stepped onto the asphalt, and walked up the exterior stairs with the deliberate slowness of someone testing whether the ground might give way. Each footfall echoed in the stairwell, a hollow reminder that this was still my life, my choice, my key in my hand. The door opened with the familiar squeak I'd meant to oil for months. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of lavender detergent and the lemon candle I lit when I needed to pretend everything was fine. I left the lights off. The street lamp through the blinds painted silver stripes across the carpet, enough to see by, enough to move without stumbling. I stood in the middle of the living room, breathing in the stillness, and felt the first crack. Not a dramatic shatter, not the kind of breakdown you see in movies with ripped photographs and thrown lamps. This was quieter, more insidious, a slow fracture along fault lines I'd ignored for decades. Emptiness poured in first, the hollow space where their voices should have been apologizing, explaining anything but laughing. I waited for the anger to follow the righteous fire that would carry me through the night, but what came instead was a strange, buoyant relief. It floated up from my stomach like carbonation, fizzy and disorienting. I was 38 years old, and for the first time I could remember no one was expecting me to fix anything. No one was waiting for me to smooth over the awkwardness, to pay the bill, to be the reliable one. The absence of that weight left me lightheaded, almost giddy, and the realization terrified me more than the loss of the money. I moved to the kitchenette, opened the junk drawer, and pulled out the small notebook where I tracked expenses in neat columns. The last entry was yesterday, $42.17 at the grocery store for ingredients I'd never be reimbursed for. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, then closed the drawer with a soft click. No more tallies. No more mental IOUs. I walked to the bedroom, flipped on the overhead light, and began. Packing was methodical, almost meditative. I chose the practical over the sentimental, 2 pairs of scrubs still in hospital plastic jeans that actually fit the sturdy sneakers I wore for 12-hour shifts. I folded my favorite cardigan, the one Mom once said made me look frumpy, but comfortable, and laid it on top. The suitcase was the same one I'd bought for a nursing conference in Cleveland 3 years ago, the one I'd never used for vacation because someone always needed me at home. I filled it halfway, then stopped. The rest of the space felt like a dare. What else was I allowed to take into a life that was suddenly shockingly mine? I left the framed photo of Grandma on the dresser. She'd understand. I left the extra set of sheets Mom had bought just in case company came, the ones that still smelled like her fabric softener. I left the slow cooker Evelyn had borrowed and never returned. Each omission felt like shedding skin, painful but necessary. When the suitcase was zipped, I stood in the bathroom doorway and studied my reflection under the harsh fluorescent bulb. My eyes were red-rimmed but dry. My hair had escaped its ponytail in frizzy wisps. I looked like any exhausted nurse at the end of a shift, except the exhaustion went deeper than bone. I splashed cold water on my face, patted it dry with the hand towel that matched nothing else in the apartment, and made a decision. No tears tonight. Not yet. The note took longer than the packing. I sat at the small dining table with a single sheet of printer paper and a pen that skipped every third letter. At first, I wrote apologies. Sorry for the inconvenience. Sorry for the drama. Sorry for not being the daughter they ordered. I crossed them out until the page looked like a battlefield. Then I wrote the truth, or as close to it as I could manage in the space of a breath. This isn't a goodbye, it's a balance sheet. I left the fake spare key, the one labeled Claire's Apt, in Mom's looping handwriting on top of the note. The real key, the one that actually worked, stayed in my pocket. I propped the paper against the salt shaker so it would be the first thing they saw if they came looking. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door behind me, and carried the suitcase down the stairs without looking back. The night had cooled. My breath fogged in the air as I loaded the car. I was halfway to the trunk when a voice floated across the parking lot, soft but unmistakable. Claire. That you, honey? Margaret stood on her balcony 1 floor up, wrapped in a quilted robe the color of storm clouds, her white hair pinned in curlers. She'd lived in 2B since before I moved in, widowed for longer than I'd been alive, and we'd exchanged pleasantries over mailboxes and trash days for years. She watered her geraniums religiously, and always had a kind word for the delivery drivers. Tonight, her eyes were sharp behind her glasses, taking in the suitcase the set of my shoulders the way I held myself like someone balancing on a tightrope. Everything all right? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I hesitated. The old Claire would have smiled, said something about a last-minute trip, changed the subject. Instead, I met her gaze. I'm leaving, I said simply. For good. Margaret nodded once as if I'd confirmed the weather. Good for you, she murmured. She disappeared inside for a moment, then reappeared, holding something small that glinted in the porch light. Catch. She tossed it down a key landing with a soft clink in my outstretched palm. My real key. The one I'd just locked the door with. Figured you might want the spare that actually works, she said. I've had it since the super changed the locks last year. Never told a soul. I stared at the metal in my hand, warm from her pocket. Why? Because sometimes a woman needs to know she's not as trapped as she thinks. She leaned on the railing, studying me with the calm of someone who'd seen every variety of heartbreak. You go on now. I'll keep an eye on things. I slipped the key into my pocket beside its twin, the weight of it grounding me. Thank you, Margaret. Don't thank me yet. Her smile was small but fierce. Just drive safe. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled out of the complex without checking the rear view. The road ahead was dark, the lines on the pavement blurring into one continuous thread. Behind me, the apartment building shrank to a single lit window. Margaret's before disappearing entirely. I didn't know where I was going, only that I wouldn't stop until the ache in my chest eased into something I could name. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of tires on asphalt, and the occasional click of the turn signal when I changed lanes out of habit. Hours later, when I finally pulled into a motel off the interstate and lay on a bed that smelled of bleach and strangers, I replayed Margaret's parting words. They circled my mind like a promise I hadn't earned yet. Margaret later told me, "You didn't leave that night you detonated." The motel's neon vacancy sign buzzed like a trapped insect outside the thin curtains, its pink glow bleeding across the lumpy bedspread where I lay fully clothed. Margaret's words still echoed in the hollow of my skull. Detonated, she'd said, as if I'd set off something irreversible. I hadn't slept. The clock on the nightstand read 3:12 a.m. when my phone first vibrated against the particle board dresser. The screen lit up with Mom in bold white letters the same way it had every Sunday for years when she needed a recipe or a ride to the hairdresser. I let it ring until the vibration stopped, then watched the missed call icon appear like a tiny red wound. 30 seconds later, it started again. I turned the ringer to silent and rolled onto my side, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of nowhere. By dawn, I'd counted 17 missed calls, all from home. No texts yet. Mom hated typing with her thumbs, but I knew they were coming. I showered in the cramped stall, letting the lukewarm water drum against my shoulders, until the mirror fogged completely. When I stepped out, towel-wrapped and dripping, the phone was rattling again. This time, Dad's name flashed. I pictured him pacing the kitchen in his slippers, the ones with the hole in the toe he refused to throw away, his face the color of raw steak. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short, his voice gravelly with sleep and fury. "Claire, you get your ass back here and explain yourself. This is ridiculous." Click. "No, please, no worry, just command." I deleted it before the echo settled. I checked out at 8, paid cash for the room, and drove to the 24-hour diner 2 exits down. The waitress called me Hun and refilled my coffee without asking. I sat in a booth by the window watching semis rumble past on the interstate and finally turned the phone face up. 32 missed calls now split between Mom and Dad. Evelyn hadn't bothered two beneath her, probably. The first text arrived while I sipped burnt coffee. "Mom, of course. Claire, where are you? We're worried sick." Another. "Your father's blood pressure is through the roof." Then. "At least tell us you're safe." The pleas stacked like bricks, each one heavier than the last. But I noticed the pattern: no apology, no mention of the money, just the assumption that I'd eventually fold. I paid the bill and drove back toward town. Not home, never home again, but close enough to orbit. Margaret's apartment complex appeared on the right, the geraniums on her balcony a defiant splash of red against the gray morning. I parked in the visitor spot and climbed the stairs, my legs heavy with the weight of a night without sleep. She opened the door before I knocked, already dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks, her hair pinned neatly as if she'd been waiting. "Figured you'd circle back," she said, stepping aside. "Come in before the vultures spot you." Her living room smelled of cinnamon and old books. She poured coffee into a china cup. Real china, not the chipped mugs I was used to. and set a plate of oatmeal cookies between us. I wrapped my hands around the warmth and told her everything, or as much as I could without crying. She listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp behind bifocals. When I finished, she nodded once. "They'll escalate," she warned. "First tears, then anger, then bargains. Seen it 100 times." She reached for her own phone, an older model with actual buttons, and scrolled through her call log. "Your mother rang my doorbell at 6:30 this morning. Left a note under the mat when I didn't answer." She slid the paper across the table. Mom's handwriting shaky but determined. "Margaret. Have you seen Claire? We're frantic. Call me." "She'll be back," Margaret said. "They always are when the first wave hits." She refilled my cup without asking. "You staying quiet?" I nodded. Good. Silence is a blade they don't expect. The calls kept coming all morning, a relentless pulse against my thigh. I'd moved the phone to vibrate only and buried it under a stack of Margaret's gardening magazines, but I could still feel each buzz like a mosquito bite. Mom left voicemails now, her voice trembling on the edge of tears. "Honey, please just let us know you're okay. We didn't mean to upset you." Then 10 minutes later, a sharper edge. "This is childish, Claire. Running off like a teenager. Dad's messages were pure thunder. You think you can just disappear? Pick up the damn phone." Evelyn finally texted at noon, a single line dripping with disdain. "Really mature, Claire. Grow up." I read it twice, then deleted the thread. Margaret watched me over the rim of her cup. "Your sister's next," she predicted. Mark my words. By afternoon, the voicemails had evolved. Mom's trembling had turned to pleading laced with guilt trips about Dad's heart and how stress wasn't good for him. She mentioned the money exactly once in a whisper. "We can talk about the loan, sweetie. No need to overreact." Dad's rage peaked in a call I accidentally answered when I meant to decline. His voice boomed through the speaker before I could hang up. "You ungrateful little, after everything we've done." Margaret took the phone from my hand, ended the call, and turned it off completely. "Let them stew," she said. "Panic's a seasoning best served cold." She became my relay station. Every hour or so, she'd step onto her balcony with a watering can, casually glancing toward my old apartment or the street below, then report back in clipped sentences. "Your mother's car just pulled up. She's knocking on your door with a casserole." 10 minutes later, she's crying now. Left the dish on the mat. Then, Dad's pacing the parking lot, yelling into his phone. Neighbor across the way peeked out, think he scared her. I sat on Margaret's couch, knees drawn to my chest, and felt the strangest thing power. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind, but a quiet shift like the moment a fever breaks. They were the ones scrambling now, their voices cracking over airwaves while I sipped coffee in peace. The real jolt came just after 4. Margaret's landline rang. She still had one mounted on the kitchen wall like a relic. She answered with a brisk "yes," and listened for a long moment, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. When she hung up, she turned to me with a smile that was almost mischievous. "That was Doris from church. Works in HR at Evelyn's company." She paused for effect. "Your sister's been suspended pending investigation." Something about falsifying expense reports, thousands apparently. "They're auditing her department." The words landed like a slap I hadn't expected to enjoy. Evelyn, the golden child who could do no wrong, caught with her hand in the cookie jar. I stared at Margaret, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren. I should have felt vindicated, should have laughed or cheered, but what washed over me was a cool, steady satisfaction. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of timing. Margaret refilled my cup again. "Karma's got a short fuse this week," she said. I nodded, turning the phone back on just long enough to see the screen light up with fresh desperation. "Mom." Dad, even a number I didn't recognize, probably Evelyn begging for advice she'd never take. I powered it down again and slipped it into my pocket. The calls would keep coming, the panic would mount, but I was done listening. Funny thing about greed, it never travels alone. The words hung in Margaret's quiet living room like smoke that refused to clear. Greed never travels alone. I set the coffee cup down the ceramic base, clicking against the saucer with a sound too sharp for the hush that followed. Outside, a delivery truck backfired, and I flinched, my nerves still raw from the night. Margaret watched me with the patience of someone who had long ago learned to wait out storms. I rubbed my palms over my jeans, feeling the weave of the denim like a map of every mile I'd driven to escape. The silence stretched thick with the weight of what I hadn't yet said aloud until I realized the only way forward was backward into the rooms I'd spent a lifetime trying to leave. I was 6 the first time I understood the shape of favoritism. It was Easter Sunday, the kitchen bright with sunlight, and the smell of dyed eggs cooling on newspaper. Evelyn, 8 and already tall for her age, had spilled an entire bottle of purple dye across the linoleum. Mom knelt with paper towels, cooing, "It's okay, baby." Accidents happen. While I stood on a chair, stirring deviled egg filling my apron, too big, the hem dragging in the bowl. When I knocked over the salt shaker, barely a spill, Mom's voice snapped like a rubber band. "Claire, watch what you're doing. We don't have money to waste." Evelyn got a new dress that afternoon to replace the one speckled with dye. I wore last year's hand-me-down, the hem let out with crooked stitches I'd sewn myself. Dad ruffled my hair and said nothing. The pattern calcified early. Report cards came home mined straight A's. Evelyn's a scatter of B's and C's, and Mom framed Evelyn's because she tried so hard. I learned to hide my honor roll certificates in my sock drawer. When the school band needed chaperones for the away game, Mom volunteered me. Evelyn got to stay home with a migraine that miraculously cleared once the bus left. I told myself it was fair Evelyn was sensitive. Evelyn struggled. Evelyn needed. The phrase became a lullaby I sang to my own disappointment. At 12, I gave up ballet because the lessons were too expensive, then watched Evelyn take private art classes that cost twice as much. Mom's explanation was always the same, delivered with a tired smile and a pat on my shoulder. "Evelyn just needs more help, Claire. You're the strong one." Dad's silence was its own language. He'd sit in his recliner newspaper spread like a shield, while Mom orchestrated the latest redistribution of resources. When I was 14 and begged for a secondhand bike so I could ride to my library job, he glanced up long enough to mutter, "Ask your mother." Mom decided the money was better spent on Evelyn's cheerleading uniform. I walked the 3 miles each way, sneakers wearing thin at the soles, and saved every paycheck until I could buy the bike myself. Dad noticed it leaning against the garage one afternoon and said, "Look sturdy," before retreating behind the sports section. I waited for pride for acknowledgement, but the moment passed like exhaust in the air. High school graduation offered a brief illusion of equity. I'd earned a partial scholarship to nursing school. Evelyn had barely scraped through with a guidance counselor's intervention. Mom threw a party in the backyard, streamers, a sheet cake from the warehouse club, neighbors milling with plastic cups of lemonade. The banner read, "Congrats, Evelyn," in glittery letters. My name was added in smaller sticker letters beneath an afterthought. I smiled for photos while Evelyn posed with her acceptance letter to a community college she'd attend for 1 semester before dropping out. Mom hugged her tight and whispered, "We're so proud of how far you've come." To me, she said, "Make sure you thank your aunt for the graduation check." The check went into the joint account for Evelyn's moving expenses to an apartment she never kept clean. College cemented the roles. I worked nights at the diner, weekends at the hospital as a candy striper, sleeping in snatches between classes. Mom called collect from payphones to ask if I could send $20 for Evelyn's textbooks, then $50 for her car insurance, then $100 because she's having a rough month. Dad's only contribution was a grunt when the bills came due. I sent the money, told myself it was temporary, that once I graduated, I'd be free. But freedom was a moving target. When I landed my first nursing job, Mom suggested I move back home to save on rent. The spare room had already been promised to Evelyn, who was between opportunities. I rented my tiny apartment instead, and the cycle continued. Birthday checks earmarked for Evelyn's latest crisis vacation days. Surrendered so she could borrow my car for job interviews she never attended. Grandma was the only counterweight. She lived 20 minutes away in the small brick house where Mom grew up, the one with the wraparound porch and the lilac bushes that bloomed purple every May. She'd call me on Sunday evenings, her voice crackly over the landline, and ask about my patience, my studies, my dreams. "You're building something solid, Claire Bear," she'd say. "Don't let them chip away at it." She slipped me 20s folded into get-well cards, told me to hide them from Mom. When I turned 25, she took me to the bank and added my name to a small savings account, hers from decades of substitute teaching and pinching pennies after Grandpa died. "This is for you," she whispered as the teller stamped the forms. "Not a loan, not a gift to be shared. Yours." The balance was modest, but the promise was immense. One day when she was gone, the house and the remainder would be mine. Dad was there that day, standing quietly in the lobby, and he nodded when Grandma explained. "That's right," he said. "Claire's earned it." I clung to that promise the way sailors cling to lighthouses. Nursing school debt mounted, but I pictured the house, its creaky floors, the attic full of Grandma's quilts, the garden where she taught me to plant tomatoes. It was my inheritance, my proof that someone saw me. Grandma's health declined slowly. First the walker, then the oxygen tank, then the hospital bed in the living room. I visited every free evening, reading to her from library books, pureeing soups she could swallow. Mom managed the meds. Evelyn popped in for photo ops. Dad sat in the corner chair, newspaper, forgotten, holding Grandma's hand when he thought no one noticed. The end came on a Tuesday in October. I was at work when the call came. Mom's voice flat, eerily calm. "She's gone, Claire. Come home." I drove through rain that slashed the windshield like accusations. The house smelled of antiseptic and wilting flowers. Grandma lay peaceful under the quilt she'd made for my high school graduation, the one Mom had tried to repurpose for Evelyn's dorm. I kissed her forehead, still warm, and felt the first sob rise. Dad stood by the window, shoulders hunched. Mom bustled with funeral arrangements. Evelyn scrolled her phone in the kitchen. 2 weeks later, the will was read in a sterile law office downtown. Mom sat ramrod straight, clutching a tissue she never used. Evelyn examined her nails. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began. "The house, the accounts, everything left to Mom in trust for the family's benefit. My name appeared once in a clause about personal effects. Grandma's teapot and a box of recipe cards." I stared at the page, the words swimming. Dad shifted beside me, cleared his throat, but said nothing. Mom reached over and patted my knee. "It's for the best, honey. We'll need the space for Evelyn's future." The promise, the bank visit, the years of whispered assurances erased with a signature I never saw coming. I left the office in a daze, rain soaking my coat. Dad caught my arm in the parking lot. "Your grandmother changed her mind at the end," he said, eyes on the pavement. "She wanted to keep things simple." I searched his face for guilt, for anything, but found only the same passive mask. Mom called that night to ask if I'd help clean out Grandma's closets. Evelyn could use some of those scarves. I hung up without answering. Now, sitting in Margaret's living room with the phone finally silent, I opened the drawer where I'd stored the few things I'd salvaged from Grandma's house. Beneath a stack of sympathy cards was a single envelope yellowed with age, addressed to me in Grandma's spidery script. I'd found it wedged in the teapot the day we packed her kitchen, overlooked by Mom's eager hands. My fingers trembled as I slid out the single sheet. "Claire Bear. If you're reading this, I'm gone and things didn't go as planned. There's more to the family story than you've been told. Papers in the attic trunk under the blue quilt. Trust your gut. You were always the one who saw clearly. The house was meant for you, but some truths are heavier than bricks. Forgive me for not fighting harder. Love always, Grandma." I traced the ink, the slight smudge where a tear had fallen. The attic trunk. The blue quilt. A larger mystery hinted at but never explained. The promise of inheritance wasn't just broken, it was buried. That promise died the same day Grandma did. The paper trembled in my fingers long after the ink had dried in my memory. Grandma's warning about truths heavier than bricks settled like lead in my stomach. But the day was already slipping toward noon, and Margaret's guest room had become a temporary bunker. I folded the letter, slid it into the pocket of my jeans, and stood at the window watching a mail truck idle across the street. My phone, still powered off since yesterday's barrage, lay on the coffee table like a sleeping animal. I needed air distance, something to dilute the bitterness rising in my throat. Margaret had gone to the senior center for bridge club, leaving a note on the fridge, back by 3. Eat something. I obeyed the second part, heating leftover soup in her microwave, the hum of the appliance the only sound in the quiet apartment. I was rinsing the bowl when the landline rang, startling me so badly I dropped the sponge. Margaret's old rotary phone looked like a museum piece, but the shrill bell demanded attention. The caller ID read, First Community Bank. My pulse kicked. I'd banked there since high school. The tellers still knew me by name. I lifted the receiver with the caution of someone defusing a bomb. Hello, Ms. Claire Thompson. The woman's voice was crisp professional, but edged with urgency. This is Lisa from Loan Services. We need to speak with you regarding an account in your name. I gripped the cord. I'm listening. There's a co-signed personal loan for $15,000 opened jointly with Barbara Thompson 18 months ago. The first payment was missed last month and we're required to notify both parties. She paused, papers rustling. The address on file is your previous apartment, but the call forwarded here. Can you confirm your identity? My mouth went dry. 15,000. Barbara Thompson. My mother. I recited my social security number on autopilot, heard the click of keys, then Lisa's tone softened. Thank you. We'll need you to come in today if possible. Bring ID. There's some irregularity with the documentation. I hung up the receiver, heavy in my hand. 18 months ago, I'd been pulling double shifts to cover a broken transmission on my car. I hadn't co-signed anything. I grabbed my purse, scribbled a note for Margaret, and drove the 6 miles to the bank on autopilot, the letter in my pocket burning like a coal. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and old carpet. Lisa met me at a side office, mid-30s, kind eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. She closed the door, gestured to a chair, and slid a folder across the desk. I'm sorry to spring this on you, she began. But the loan originated at another branch and red flags popped during routine audit. She opened the folder. My signature stared back at me, neat loops and crosses I recognized from paychecks and consent forms. Except I'd never seen this document. The date was stamped clearly, March of last year. The purpose line read, Evelyn Thompson, business startup. My vision tunneled. That's not possible. Lisa's expression confirmed it. The co-signer Barbara Thompson provided identification and claimed you were unavailable but had verbally agreed. Standard procedure requires both parties present, but the branch manager at the time was new and overlooked it. She turned another page, this one a disbursement record. Funds were deposited into an account under Evelyn's name, then withdrawn in cash over several transactions. She hesitated. There's more. The repayment account is linked to your father's payroll, but the payments stopped after 6 months. I leaned forward, scanning the numbers. 15,000 disbursed. 6 payments of 400 each made. Balance due 13,200 plus late fees. My name sat bold at the top co-borrower. What happens now? Collections will accelerate. Your credit will be impacted unless we resolve this. We can file an identity fraud report, but we'll need your cooperation. She handed me a pen. Sign here to freeze the account and initiate investigation. I signed the pen, scratching like an accusation. Lisa made copies, promised a follow-up call, and walked me to the door with the gentle sympathy reserved for accident victims. Outside, the sun beat down on the parking lot, but I felt iced over. I sat in my car with the AC blasting, staring at the folder on the passenger seat. One sheet slipped out, an internal memo clipped to the back. I unfolded it. Subject Loan 4782, B. Additional notes. Originating manager flagged for review. Borrower. Evelyn T. provided receipts for business expenses, including casino cash advances and online gaming deposits. Co-signer Barbara T. instructed to route repayments through personal checking to avoid scrutiny. Primary debtor Robert T. listed as guarantor on separate credit line with history of delinquent gambling markers. The words blurred. Casino cash advances. Dad's Saturday golf trips that ended with him napping in the recliner pockets turned out. Mom's frantic calls about unexpected bills. Evelyn's consulting that never produced a client. I pieced it together like a puzzle. I'd been too polite to notice Dad's losses funneled through a fake business loan my name forged to secure it. Mom's signature binding me to the mess. The $15,000 hadn't built a company. It had fed slot machines and blackjack tables, then vanished into Evelyn's manicured hands. I drove to the public library needing neutral ground. In a corral by the back windows, I spread the documents across the table. The withdrawal dates aligned with Dad's paydays, the amounts shrinking as his checks bounced. One receipt photocopied in the file showed a $5,000 cash advance at River's Edge Casino the same night I'd worked a holiday shift to cover Mom's emergency dentist bill. Another showed Evelyn's signature on a check made out to cash endorsed at a check-cashing storefront. My credit report pulled fresh at the bank showed the loan as 30 days past due, a black mark already blooming. I sat back, the chair creaking under me. The exploitation wasn't new. It was systematic. Every extra shift I'd taken, every birthday check I'd handed over, every time I'd chosen thrift store scrubs so Evelyn could have name-brand boots. It had all been siphoned into the same black hole. My savings, my name, my future. Collateral for their addiction. The $5,000 they'd demanded at dinner wasn't a loan. It was a refill. And I'd been the designated donor my entire adult life. The library clock ticked toward closing. I gathered the papers, my hands steadier now, the ice in my veins crystallizing into something sharp. I stopped at the copier, made 2 sets, and slipped one into an envelope addressed to myself at Margaret's. The other I folded into my purse. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was identity theft with a smile. They didn't just steal my money. They stole my name. The library doors locked behind me with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching the envelope of copies, the late afternoon sun slanting through the maples and striping the pavement gold. My car sat alone at the far end of the lot, but my feet carried me the opposite direction back toward the apartment complex where Margaret waited. The phrase, "they stole my name," looped in my head like a scratched record, each repetition carving deeper. I needed more than distance now. I needed a map through the wreckage. Margaret's door opened before my knuckles touched wood. She took one look at my face and stepped aside without a word. The living room smelled of fresh-baked cornbread. A legal pad and a stack of file folders waited on the coffee table like soldiers at attention. She guided me to the couch, pressed a glass of iced tea into my hand, and sat opposite in her wingback chair, hands folded, eyes steady. "Start at the beginning," she said. "Leave nothing out." I laid the bank folder between us and walked her through every line, the forged signature. The casino withdrawals, the missed payments now accruing interest like mold. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough for the ice in my glass to shift and clink. Margaret leaned forward, opened the top folder, and slid out a laminated business card. Margaret Hollis, CFP, retired. Certified financial planner. 32 years with First Community before she walked away with a gold watch and a pension. I trained half the loan officers who approved that mess, she said, including the one who bent the rules for your mother. She flipped the card over and began writing in neat block letters. First lesson. What they did is elder financial abuse. If your grandmother's estate was involved, identity theft if not. Both are felonies in this state. She underlined the word felonies twice. Second lesson. You don't need to prove intent to ruin them. You only need to prove the paper trail. She tore the page off, handed it to me. File the fraud affidavit with the bank tomorrow. They'll freeze collections and open an internal investigation. That buys you 30 days. I stared at the list affidavit police report credit freeze. Clinical steps for a wound that felt anything but. What if they fight back? They will, she said. But fighting costs money they no longer have. She opened another folder, this one thicker edges worn soft. Inside were photocopies of old newspaper clippings, a high school yearbook photo, a faded Polaroid of two teenage girls in matching sundresses. One was unmistakably my mother 17 and laughing. The other was Margaret Hare in victory rolls, arms slung around Mom's shoulders. Barbara Jean and I were thicker than blood, once she said. Shared secrets, dreams, the kind of friendship that survives distance until it doesn't. She traced the photo with a fingertip. Your mother married your father fresh out of secretarial school. I went to college on scholarship, landed the bank job. We stayed close until your grandmother got sick the first time, heart trouble, early 80s. Barbara quit work to care for her, moved into the brick house on Elm. I visited every Sunday with casseroles and gossip. Her voice softened. That's when I noticed the shift. Money disappearing from your grandmother's accounts. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there. Barbara said it was medical bills. I offered to review the statements. She changed the subject. Margaret pulled out a yellowed ledger page. Your grandmother kept meticulous records. This is from 1987. See the withdrawals. All signed. Barbara Jean Thompson, authorized user. But the corresponding deposits never hit the household account. She tapped a column. They went into a separate savings your mother opened at a different branch. I confronted her. She cried, said your father had debts that Evelyn barely too then needed things. I backed off. Friendship over principle. Biggest regret of my life. I swallowed hard. The pattern was genetic, apparently. Margaret continued, voice steady as a metronome. When your grandmother's final illness came, I was there the night before she passed. She was lucid, asked for her lockbox. Wanted to add a codicil to the will, something about you specifically. Barbara sent me home early, said the nurse was coming. Next morning, your grandmother was gone and the lockbox was empty. She met my eyes. I saw the new will 2 days later at the attorney's. Signature looked off shaky, not her usual flourish. I said nothing. Cowardice again. She closed the folder, set it aside like discarding a bad memory. Here's the philosophy, Claire, and you write it down. Justice ages well. Revenge doesn't. She waited until I scribbled the words. Revenge is sugar. It spikes and crashes. Justice is protein, slow, sustaining, impossible to ignore. You gather evidence, you file reports, you let the system grind. They'll scream, they'll beg, they'll blame you. Let them. Every tantrum is another nail. I looked at the legal pad, the neat columns she'd already started, dates, amounts, witnesses. My handwriting joined hers, shaky but determined. What about Grandma's house, I asked. The promise Dad witnessed. Margaret's smile was thin, sharp. Your mother didn't inherit that house. She took it. She reached into the bottom folder and produced a single sheet, a notary log from the day Grandma died. 2 witnesses. 1 notary. The notary's stamp was crisp, but the second witness signature was Barbara's, dated the same day, hours after Grandma's recorded time of death. Impossible to witness a will after the testator is gone, Margaret said quietly. I kept this copy. Insurance, I told myself. Never thought I'd need it. The room tilted, then righted. Every secret I'd carried alone now had a partner in Margaret's steady gaze. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a fresh legal pad and 2 pens. We start tonight, she said. Bank records, credit reports, the will challenge. Quiet, methodical, legal. By the time they realize the walls are closing, the doors will already be locked. She sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time since the dinner table, I felt the ground solidify beneath me. Your mother didn't inherit that house. She took it. The notary's stamp stared up from Margaret's coffee table like a tiny gravestone. She took it. The words settled between us heavier than any verdict. Margaret closed the folder with a soft snap, then stood and carried the cornbread to the kitchen as if sealing the moment. I remained on the couch, the legal pad warm against my thighs, the list of steps already forming in my mind. No more reacting. From this second forward, every move would be deliberate, documented, and invisible. We began that night. Margaret produced a banker's box from her hall closet, the kind with a metal latch, and reinforced corners labeled 2019. Tax in her precise handwriting. She emptied it onto the rug manila envelopes. Accordion files, a small external hard drive the size of a deck of cards. Clean slate, she said. Your war room. I labeled the first envelope bank fraud and slid the loan copies inside. The second became email archive. The third, medical power of attorney. By midnight, we had a system color-coded tabs, chronological order, cross-references in the margins. Margaret brewed decaf and kept the cookies coming. I typed on her ancient desktop until my eyes burned. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office at opening. The lobby smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I requested every public record tied to my name for the past 5 years: property liens, UCC filings, court judgments. The clerk, a woman with a nameplate reading Dolores, raised an eyebrow at the stack of forms but stamped them without comment. While the printer whirred, I slipped across the street to the post office and rented a P.O. box under my initials only. No home address, no forwarding. Every piece of mail from now on would land there safe from prying eyes. Back at Margaret's, I set up a dedicated Gmail account with 2-factor authentication and a password longer than my childhood phone number. I forwarded every bank alert, every credit card offer, every hospital billing statement I'd ever ignored. The inbox filled like a dam, breaking utility overages in my name. From the old house, a credit card I'd never applied for with a $2,000 balance at a jewelry store, a car loan for a vehicle I'd never driven. Each discovery was a pin on a map of theft. I printed, highlighted, scanned, and filed. Margaret taught me to photograph every document with my phone, time-stamped, geotagged, then upload to the encrypted drive. Redundancy is armor, she said. By the third day, we had a timeline taped across her dining room wall, a roll of butcher paper stretching 10 feet marked in red for withdrawals, blue for deposits, green for forgeries. The pattern was surgical. Dad's gambling losses peaked every March and September tax refund season and bonus time. Mom routed the money through Evelyn's business account, then siphoned it back to cover the holes. My name appeared as cosigner on 3 separate occasions, each signature a progressively worse imitation. I stared at the wall until the numbers blurred, then added a 4th color purple for medical bills. Dad's ER visit last year for chest pain had been charged to an account in my name. The deductible alone was $3,000. Margaret's lawyer arrived on a Thursday afternoon, parking his sensible Buick 2 blocks away and walking the rest. Harold Jenkins, 71, retired partner from the firm that handled Grandma's original estate. He wore a cardigan despite the heat and carried a leather briefcase older than I was. Margaret met him at the door with iced tea and a handshake that lingered. Harry's forgotten more about probate than most attorneys ever learned, she said. We convened at the table, the timeline unrolled like a battle plan. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in margins so tiny they looked like Morse code. When I finished, he removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. Identity theft. Fraudulent conveyance possible. Undue influence on the will, he summarized. We'll need affidavits from the bank, the notary, and any medical personnel who witnessed your grandmother's final days. He tapped the purple section. This medical proxy is a separate felony if your father was competent when it was executed. He slid a retainer agreement across the table, flat fee payable from any recovery. We file nothing until the evidence is airtight. No discovery, no depositions, no contact with opposing counsel. We build the case in the dark. I signed. The pen felt heavier than any IV needle I'd ever pushed. Harold outlined the next steps: subpoena Deuce's Tecum for bank records, a quiet title action on Grandma's house, a freeze on the joint accounts. Every motion would be sealed until the moment of service. They'll wake up to a sheriff at the door, he said. And by then, it will be too late to hide the bodies. We worked in shifts. Mornings at the library printing microfiche of old property deeds. Afternoons at the courthouse pulling marriage certificates, birth records, anything that might show a pattern of asset shifting. Evenings at Margaret's cross-checking dates against Evelyn's social media posts. Photos from Vegas the same week a $5,000 withdrawal cleared. I learned to read metadata to spot Photoshop artifacts in scanned signatures. Harold reviewed each batch, marking what was admissible, what was circumstantial, what could be weaponized. The dining room became a fortress of paper and silence. 10 days in the plan was nearly complete. Harold had drafted a 30-page complaint, every paragraph a landmine. We scheduled filing for the following Monday electronic submission at 8:01 a.m. to avoid courthouse gossip. I was photographing the final batch of casino receipts when Margaret's landline rang. She answered in the kitchen, her voice dropping to a murmur. When she returned, her face was unreadable. "Your mother," she said, holding out the receiver. "Says it's urgent." I took the phone, pressed it to my ear. Mom's voice came through thin and reedy the way it did when she was trying not to cry. "Claire, thank God. Your father's in the hospital. They think it's his heart. He's asking for you." A pause, a sniffle. "Please come. He might not have much time." I gripped the receiver, the plastic creaking. Harold raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Margaret watched me with the stillness of a chess master. I waited for the guilt to hit, the old reflex to drop everything and run. Instead, I heard the lilt at the end of Mom's sentence, the upward inflection that wasn't quite grief. "Which hospital?" I asked. "St. Mary's. ICU. Room 412. Her voice cracked, then steadied. "The doctors say minutes matter." I knew St. Mary's ICU. I'd floated there last spring. Room 412 was cardiac telemetry. Yes, but it was also the one with the window overlooking the parking lot, the one families used when they wanted privacy for difficult conversations. I thanked her, promised to call back, and hung up. Margaret's eyes never left mine. "Trap?" she asked. "Smells like one," I said. Harold closed his notebook. We proceed as planned. Illness, real or fabricated, changes nothing. He stood, gathered his papers. "I'll be at the clerk's office at 7. You stay dark until then." After he left, I stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker on. Mom's voice replayed, the tremor too perfect, the urgency too polished. I'd heard her use that tone before, when Evelyn needed bail for a traffic ticket, when Dad's truck needed tires, when the $5,000 was just the latest installment. If he was dying, why was she smiling on the phone? The question circled my skull all night, a mosquito I couldn't swat. If he was dying, why was she smiling on the phone? By 5:30, I was dressed in yesterday's scrubs, hair twisted into a knot. Margaret's spare key in my pocket, and Harold's sealed instructions taped inside my purse. I drove the back roads to St. Mary's, windows down, letting the cold slap sense into me. The ICU parking lot was half-empty, sodium lights buzzing orange over the asphalt. I badge swiped through the staff entrance I still had access to, took the service elevator to 4, and stepped into the corridor that smelled of bleach and burnt coffee. Room 412's curtain was half drawn. Dad's name was on the whiteboard in dry erase marker, but the vitals monitor outside the door was dark. I paused at the nurse's station. Jenna, a float I'd trained last spring, looked up from her charting. "Claire. Thought you were off nights." I gave her the short version, family emergency, checking on Dad. She frowned at the monitor. "Telemetry's down for maintenance." "Weird timing." She tapped the keyboard. "No admission orders, no EKG strips, no labs. You sure he's here?" My stomach tightened. I thanked her, slipped past the station, and eased the door open. Dad sat propped against pillows, hospital gown untied at the neck, flipping channels with the remote. No oxygen, no IV, no cardiac leads. Just the faint scent of his aftershave and the low hum of the TV. He startled when he saw me, remote clattering to the blanket. "Claire. You came." His voice cracked theatrically, but his color was good eyes clear. I closed the door softly behind me. Mom said heart attack. He glanced toward the hallway, then back at me, the act already fraying. "They're running tests. Thought it was bad, turns out indigestion." He tried a sheepish grin. Better safe than sorry, right? The monitor beeped once, a generic heart rhythm someone had programmed for show. I stepped closer, noting the untouched breakfast tray, the newspaper folded to the crossword. No wristband, no allergy sticker. The ruse was paper thin. Mom burst in 30 seconds later, Evelyn on her heels. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed but dry mascara intact. She clutched a manila envelope like a life raft. Thank God, she breathed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of hairspray and desperation. Evelyn hung back, arms crossed, phone glowing in her hand. Mom released me, wiped an invisible tear. The doctors want to be sure. Your father's stressed everything with you leaving the money. She stopped as if the word money had slipped out uninvited. Dad cleared his throat. Sit, kiddo. We need to talk practical. Mom thrust the envelope at me. Power of attorney. Temporary, just until he's stable. You're the responsible one. Inside were 3 crisp pages, durable power of attorney healthcare proxy, and a quitclaim deed transferring the Elm Street house to joint tenancy with right of survivorship. My name already typed beneath Mom's. The notary block was blank waiting. I took the pen she offered, heart hammering but hands steady. Let me read it. Mom hovered, fingers twitching. Dad watched the TV, feigning interest in a cereal commercial. I flipped to the deed, scanned the legal description. Grandma's house, the one Margaret said was taken. My signature would lock it away forever. I uncapped the pen, then paused. Privacy, I said. Family only. Mom hesitated, then ushered Evelyn out with a murmured excuse about coffee. The door clicked shut. I moved to the window, angling the papers so the light caught the watermark. With the pen's tip, I made microscopic adjustments, a crossed T and extra loop on the Y, enough to void the notary if scrutinized. On the power of attorney, I initialed every page but the last, then signed the deed with a deliberate flourish. Only I changed the grantee line from joint tenancy to Claire Thompson's sole owner, effective upon recording. The alteration was subtle, a single deleted word, but it flipped the entire document. I slid the pages back into the envelope, sealed it with a lick, and handed it to Mom when she returned. She beamed relief, flooding her face. You're a lifesaver. Dad nodded approval. Evelyn scrolled, her phone, thumbs flying. I excused myself to the restroom, heart racing, and lingered in the corridor outside the vending alcove. Their voices carried through the thin wall. Mom's whisper was triumphant. She signed. We're golden, Evelyn snorted. About time she was useful. Think the bank will notice the old loan. They can't trace it to us, Mom said. Your father paid cash. The paper trail's clean. Except Claire's name on it, Evelyn replied. But she'll never look. Too busy playing saint. Laughter low and conspiratorial. By the time she figures it out, the house will be ours and the debt hers. I pressed my back to the cool tile, breath shallow. They'd known about the forged loan, planned the hospital charade to lock me in before I could fight back. I slipped the real pen, Harold's spare, into my pocket, replaced it with the identical one from the nurse's station. When I returned, Mom clutched the envelope like a trophy. Dad patted the bed. Stay for the discharge paperwork. I smiled, the expression foreign on my face. Wouldn't miss it. An hour later, the doctor, a resident I recognized from the ER, arrived with discharge instructions for GERD. No cardiac event, no admission, just a script for antacids. Mom's surprise was almost comical. I kissed Dad's cheek, promised to call, and walked out with the family, waving from the curb. In the parking lot, I opened my phone, snapped photos of the altered documents I'd palmed from the envelope while Mom signed the discharge forms, then texted Harold package en route. He replied instantly. Courier picks up at P.O. Box in 20. I drove to the post office, dropped the envelope into the slot, and watched it disappear. The hospital, the signatures, the overheard confession. Every piece now documented, time-stamped, and on its way to a locked evidence locker. For once, I signed on my own terms. The hospital parking lot baked under a late summer sun heat, rippling off the asphalt in waves that distorted the rows of sedans. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off, the altered documents already speeding toward Harold's office, my pulse still thrumming from the counterfeit signatures and the overheard confession. For once, I signed on my own terms. The phrase tasted like iron and victory, but the aftertaste was hollow. I needed more than legal leverage. I needed the truth spoken aloud face to face without the buffer of phones or hospital curtains. I started the car and drove the familiar route to the house on Elm Street, the one Grandma had meant for me, the one Mom now clutched like a trophy. The driveway was empty. Dad's truck gone, probably still at the body shop, pretending to need repairs. I used the key I'd never returned, the one Margaret had tossed me the night I left. The door stuck in the humidity, then gave with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with lemon furniture polish and the ghost of Sunday roasts. Mom stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled, scrubbing a pan that didn't need it. She froze when she saw me sponge dripping onto the linoleum. Claire. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, surprise, and something sharper underneath. You came back. I closed the door behind me, the click loud in the stillness. We need to talk. She dried her hands on a dish towel embroidered with apples, movements deliberate buying time. The kitchen clock ticked above the stove, each second a hammer. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and waited. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me, eyes calculating. Your father's resting upstairs. The hospital said stress. Save it. I cut her off, the words sharper than I intended. I was at St. Mary's. Room 412. No heart attack, no admission, just a bad case of theater. Her mouth opened closed. The towel twisted in her grip. Sit down, Mom. She obeyed, pulling out a chair at the table where we'd eaten 1,000 meals. I remained standing. The high ground felt necessary. Everything I did, she began, voice trembling, but steadying, was for your sister. Evelyn's always needed more. You know that. You're strong, independent. She's fragile. The same refrain, older than my driver's license. I laughed, a sound without humor. Fragile. She's 36, Mom. She's had more second chances than I've had first ones. This isn't about Evelyn needing help. It's about you needing control. I stepped closer, the table between us like a border. The loan in my name, the forged signatures, the house you stole from Grandma. None of that was for Evelyn. It was to keep me tethered, paying for sins I didn't commit. Her chin lifted, defiance flickering. You think you're so perfect, Claire. Always the martyr, always judging. I gave you a family, a home. You gave me a ledger, I said. Every dollar I earned, every shift I worked, funneled into your holes. You didn't raise daughters. You raised one golden child and one ATM. The words hung between us, ugly and true. She flinched as if slapped. Dad appeared in the doorway, barefoot in sweatpants, hair tousled from a nap. He took in the scene, opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence he'd perfected over decades. He shuffled to the fridge, poured a glass of water he didn't drink, and leaned against the counter, eyes on the floor. Mom's gaze darted to him, pleading, but he offered nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, real ones this time. You were always his favorite, she whispered. From the day you were born. The way he looked at you, like you hung the moon. I was pregnant with Evelyn, exhausted, and he'd come home from work and ask about your day first, even when you were in diapers. Her voice broke. I tried to love you both the same, but you had him wrapped around your finger without trying. Dad's knuckles whitened around the glass. I stared at him, waiting for denial for anything. He set the glass down untouched. Barbara, he murmured a warning. No, she snapped, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her blouse. She wants truth. Fine. You think I favored Evelyn out of love. It started as balance. You got his attention, his pride, his stories at dinner. Evelyn got me. Then it became habit. Then it became punishment. She laughed, bitter and wet. Every time he bragged about your grades, your job, I gave Evelyn something you didn't get. A car, a trip alone forgiven. Petty maybe, but it evened the score. The room tilted. I gripped the table edge. Punishment for what being born. Her eyes met mine, raw and ancient. For being hers. The pronoun hung like smoke. Dad's head snapped up color, draining from his face. Mom's tears slowed, replaced by something colder. You were 2 when I found the letters. Hidden in his toolbox, scented with perfume I didn't wear. He swore it was over a mistake before Evelyn, but I saw the dates. You were already here. She swallowed. I stayed. For the family, for appearances. But every time he lit up at your school play, I remembered whose eyes you have. Dad found his voice hoarse. Barbara, stop. No, she said again, softer. She's old enough. She looked at me, really looked as if seeing a stranger wearing my face. I don't know for sure. Maybe you're his, maybe you're not. But the doubt. It lived in me like a splinter. Favoring Evelyn wasn't love. It was revenge wearing a mother's mask. The kitchen clock kept ticking indifferent. Dad sank into a chair, head in his hands. I stood frozen, the revelation a live wire in my chest. All the sacrifices, the slights, the stolen house. Not favoritism, not even greed in the simple sense. Retribution for a betrayal older than my memories. So all this time it wasn't favoritism. It was revenge. The words settled in the kitchen like dust after an explosion, coating everything in a fine, suffocating layer. So all this time it wasn't favoritism. It was revenge. Mom's confession hung between us raw and bleeding while Dad stared at the tabletop as if answers might rise from the wood grain. I backed away until my shoulders hit the refrigerator, the hum of the compressor the only sound. Mom reached for me, fingers trembling, but I was already moving past the table, past Dad's slumped form out the back door into the yard where the grass had grown too long since Grandma stopped mowing it herself. The evening air was thick with cicadas and the smell of cut hay from the neighbor's field. I walked the perimeter of the yard, tracing the fence line Grandma had painted white, every spring my sneakers sinking into the soft earth. The revelation churned inside me, a storm with no outlet. If I was the living proof of Dad's betrayal, then every slight, every stolen dollar, every rewritten will was punishment for a sin I hadn't committed. I pressed my palms to my eyes until sparks danced, then drove back to Margaret's with the windows down, letting the wind scour the tears I refused to shed. Margaret was waiting on the porch, rocking slowly in the glider, a glass of sweet tea sweating on the rail. She took one look at my face and stood. Inside, she said no questions. The living room lamps cast soft pools of light over the banker's box we'd filled with evidence. She locked the door behind us, drew the curtains, and gestured to the couch. I sank into the cushions, the weight of the day pressing me down. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a manila envelope tied with red string, the kind lawyers used before everything went digital. This came by courier while you were gone, she said, placing it in my lap. The return address was Harold's firm, but the handwriting on the front was Grandma's. Frail, but unmistakable. My breath caught. Margaret sat beside me close enough that I smelled the lavender soap on her wrists. Open it. Inside was a single document folded thrice the paper, heavy and cream-colored. A last will and testament dated 2 years before Grandma's death, witnessed by Margaret and the hospice nurse who'd cared for her in the final months. I scanned the preamble, the legalese blurring until the dispositive clause sharpened into focus. I give devise and bequeath my residence at 1427 Elm Street, together with all bank accounts, personal property, and residue of my estate, to my granddaughter Claire Marie Thompson per Stirps. No trust, no life estate for Mom, no mention of Evelyn, just me. The signatures at the bottom were steady. Grandma's looping cursive, Margaret's precise block letters, the nurse's neat print. A notary seal gleamed gold in the corner. I looked up, throat tight. This is real, Margaret nodded. Your grandmother had me keep the original in my safe deposit box after the first hospital stay. She knew her mind was slipping, but wanted one clean copy no one could touch. The version read at the attorney's office. The one that gave everything to your mother was executed 3 days before she died. She pulled a second sheet from the envelope, a photocopy of hospital discharge summary. Your grandmother was heavily medicated, barely conscious. the hospice nurse refused to witness the new will. Said it was unethical. Your mother found another notary one who worked for the same firm handling the estate. Conflict of interest from the start. She laid a third document beside the will. An affidavit from the hospice nurse sworn last year. I, Janice Reynolds, RN, do hereby state that on the evening of October 12th, the patient was non-responsive, unable to sign her name or acknowledge understanding. Barbara Thompson presented a document and requested my signature as witness. I declined. Later that night, I observed Barbara Thompson using a light table to trace signatures onto a new page. The words swam, but the image was clear. Mom hunched over Grandma's drafting table in the attic, tracing the loops and crosses she'd watched her mother make for decades. Margaret's voice was soft, but relentless. The forged will was recorded the next morning. By the time anyone could challenge capacity, your grandmother was gone and the house was in your mother's name. Probate closed in 30 days. No one asked questions because no one knew to ask. I traced Grandma's signature on the true will. The ink faded but authentic. The house, the accounts, the teapot with the chipped spout. All meant for me. The betrayal wasn't a single act, but a slow, deliberate erasure across generations. I set the papers down, hands shaking. Harold can file to set aside the probate, Margaret said. Undue influence, lack of capacity, fraud on the court. We have the nurse, the original will, the hospital records. It's a slam dunk. The phrase should have brought relief, but it landed like a stone. I pictured Mom in the courtroom, her face crumpling as the judge voided her claim. Evelyn's outrage, Dad's silence finally broken by shame. I imagined the headlines in the local paper, the whispers at church. The family name dragged through depositions and discovery. Then I pictured Grandma's garden, the lilacs she'd planted the year I was born, now choked with weeds because Mom never learned to prune. I pictured the attic trunk, the blue quilt, the secrets still waiting. Margaret watched me wrestle. You could sue, she said gently. Take back what's yours, make them pay every penny plus interest. Or you could let the truth do the work. File the police report for the forgery, the identity theft, the loan fraud. Let the state prosecute. The house comes back either way, but one path leaves you covered in mud, the other lets them drown in it. I stood, walked to the window, and parted the curtains. The street was quiet, porch lights flickering on one by one. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. I thought of Mom's confession in the kitchen, the way her voice cracked on the word hers. I thought of Grandma's letter, the one tucked in my pocket, urging me to trust my gut. Suing would be justice, swift and public. Letting the system grind would be slower, but the fallout would be theirs alone to carry. I turned back to Margaret. How long before the forgery case breaks? Harold files the police report tomorrow. Investigation takes weeks, maybe months. They'll freeze the house pending resolution. Your parents can't sell, can't borrow against it. Every day they live there, they'll know it's on borrowed time. She paused. Your call. I picked up the true will, folded it carefully, and slid it back into the envelope. The weight of it was different now. Not a weapon, but a mirror. I could swing it or hold it up and let them see themselves. The dilemma wasn't legal anymore. It was moral. Blood against blood, legacy against legacy. I set the envelope on the table beside the banker's box, the evidence stacked like bricks in a wall I hadn't decided to build or breach. Margaret poured us both tea, the ice long melted. We sat in silence until the clock struck 10, the sound echoing through the room. She reached across and squeezed my hand. Sometimes the best revenge is letting them self-destruct. The phrase settled over Margaret's living room like a verdict delivered in a whisper. Sometimes the best revenge is letting them self-destruct. I repeated it under my breath while the clock chimed 11, the sound echoing off the walls lined with framed photos of people I'd never met. Margaret rose, cleared the tea glasses, and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the banker's box and the weight of inaction. I chose the slow burn. The next morning, Harold filed the police report for forgery and identity theft. Then the bank froze every account linked to Mom's social security number. I stayed dark. No texts, No calls. No return to Elm Street. I moved into Margaret's spare room, paid rent and grocery runs and yard work, and waited for the dominoes to fall. The first sign came 3 days later. I was pruning the rose bushes when the mail carrier handed Margaret a certified letter addressed to the occupants of 1427 Elm. She brought it inside unopened, set it on the table like evidence. The return address was the county sheriff's office notice of asset freeze pending investigation. Margaret steamed it open over the kettle and we read together. All joint checking savings and the home equity line were locked. No withdrawals, no transfers, no new credit. The house itself was flagged. Any attempt to sell or refinance would trigger an automatic lis pendens. Mom's signature was required to acknowledge receipt. I pictured her standing in the driveway envelope, trembling in her manicured hands. By the end of the week, the foreclosure notice arrived. The mortgage taken out 2 years ago against Grandma's paid-off house had missed 3 payments. The bank's letter was clinical 90 days to cure or lose title. I learned this from the public records portal Harold had bookmarked for me. I sat at Margaret's desktop refreshing the docket every morning like checking vitals. The balance due climbed with late fees, attorney costs, interest compounding daily. Dad's pickup disappeared from the driveway. Repossessed Margaret's neighbor reported after a casual wave over the fence. The cable got cut, then the water pressure dropped when the utility hold kicked in. I watched it unfold through county filings and Margaret's network of church ladies who still played bridge with Mom's old crowd. Evelyn's collapse was louder. Her company, a mid-tier marketing firm downtown, announced an internal audit after an anonymous tip about expense fraud. The tip was Harold's doing, routed through the state ethics hotline to keep my name clear. By Friday, her LinkedIn vanished, her office voicemail disconnected. Margaret's friend Doris, the HR director from Part 3, called with updates over chamomile tea. They found $23,000 in fake invoices. Doris said voice hushed with scandal. Plane tickets to Vegas hotel suites, cash advances at the casino. All billed to client retainers. Evelyn was escorted out by security badge-clipped laptop confiscated. The press release was polite but damning. Employee terminated for cause matter referred to authorities. Her professional network evaporated overnight. Former colleagues blocked her on every platform. I observed it all from the sidelines, a silent spectator in my own tragedy. Mornings, I walked the neighborhood trails, earbuds in but no music, letting the crunch of gravel ground me. Afternoons, I helped Margaret catalog her late husband's coin collection, sorting wheat pennies by mint mark, while the radio played old standards. The detachment wasn't cold, it was survival. Glee would have required energy I no longer possessed. Instead, I felt a strange hollowness, like watching a house you once lived in burn from across the street. The plea came on a Tuesday 10 days after the freeze. My phone, still on Do Not Disturb, lit up with Evelyn's name. I let it ring, then listened to the voicemail in the quiet of Margaret's sunroom. Her voice was stripped of its usual polish, hoarse from crying or shouting, maybe both. "Claire, please. They're saying I could go to jail." I didn't know it would snowball like this. I just needed, we needed, a little breathing room. "Call me back. I'll pay you whatever you want. No apology, just bargaining." I deleted it, but the calls kept coming, escalating in desperation. Texts at 2 a.m., Mom's in the ER, stress-related. Dad's truck is gone, we're stranded. The house is posting for sheriff's sale. Each message a drip of acid on the shield I'd built. The in-person ambush happened at the grocery store. I was reaching for oat milk when Evelyn appeared at the end of the aisle, hair unwashed, mascara smudged into bruises. She looked 10 years older. "Claire." Her voice cracked the fluorescent hum. Shoppers slowed, sensing drama. She grabbed a carton of eggs like a prop. "We have to talk." I set the milk in my cart. "We're talking." "Not here." She glanced around, paranoid. "They're watching the house. Reporters, creditors. Mom hasn't slept in days." Her hands shook so badly the eggs rattled. "You win, okay? Take the house. Take everything. Just make it stop." I studied her, the sister who'd once talked Mom into buying her a convertible while I biked to work. "You knew about the loan," I said quietly. The forged signature, the casino cash. You knew and spent it anyway. Her eyes darted. It was Dad's mess. You just took. I stepped closer, voice low. Every betrayal you referenced in your texts, the ones you want me to forget, they're documented. Police reports, bank freezes, audits. I didn't start the fire, Evelyn. I just stopped putting it out. Tears spilled genuine this time. Please, I'll leave town. I'll sign whatever. Just call them off. I pushed my cart past her. There's no them, just consequences. She followed me to the checkout, pleading under her breath, but I paid for my groceries and walked out without looking back. In the parking lot, I sat in the car until my breathing evened, then blocked her number. The collapse accelerated. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the courthouse steps. Dad's pension garnishment hit. 15% straight to the bank. Mom's part-time job at the craft store ended when the background check flagged the investigation. Their church friends stopped answering calls. I learned these details in fragments, a sheriff's deputy chatting with Margaret over the hedge, a foreclosure listing emailed by Harold, a tearful voice message from Mom that I deleted unheard. The house sold at auction for pennies on the dollar, bought by an investor who flipped it within a week. They rented a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the kind with coin-operated showers. I never visited. I never answered. The calls tapered from daily to weekly, then to silence, punctuated by a single text from an unknown number. We're sorry. I archived it without reply. Margaret and I planted tomatoes in her backyard, the soil rich and dark the way Grandma's had been. Their calls grew fewer, until only one remained. The single remaining call came on a Tuesday in early October, the kind of crisp morning when the maple leaves turned the sidewalk into a red carpet. I was kneeling in Margaret's garden fingers deep in the cool soil, transplanting the last of the pansies when my phone vibrated against my hip. The number was blocked, but the area code was local. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered, expecting another creditor or a wrong number. Evelyn's voice cracked through the line, thin and unfamiliar, stripped of its usual bravado. Claire, it's Mom. She's dying. The trowel slipped from my grip, clattering against the ceramic pot. I stood slowly, the garden spinning for a moment. What do you mean, dying? Liver failure. Cirrhosis. The doctors say days, maybe a week. A pause filled with the sound of her swallowing tears or pride, I couldn't tell. She's at home. Hospice. She won't go to the hospital. Another pause longer. There's a letter. And a key. She wants you to have them. Said to tell you the safe in the attic. Under the blue quilt. The line crackled. Please come. I hung up without promising anything. The pansies waited half-planted, their purple faces turned toward the sun. I stared at them until Margaret appeared on the porch, coffee in hand, eyebrows raised in silent question. I told her everything, the words tumbling out like stones from an overturned wheelbarrow. She listened, then set the mug down and wrapped her arms around me, the scent of her lavender soap grounding me. You don't owe them this, she said, but you owe yourself the choice. The debate began the moment I stepped inside. I paced the living room, tracing the same 3 steps from couch to window and back, the floorboards creaking in protest. Part of me wanted to delete the voicemail block, the number, let the past bury itself with Mom. I'd built a life here. Quiet mornings with Margaret, evenings reading in the sunroom, the garden that bloomed without demands. Returning meant stepping back into the house where every room held a memory of being less than. It meant facing Evelyn's desperation. Dad's silence, Mom's final performance. I pictured the attic, the blue quilt Grandma had pieced from my old baby clothes, the safe I'd never known existed. What could be inside that warranted a deathbed summons? I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad listing pros and cons like a patient charting symptoms. Pro closure answers the possibility of understanding. Con reopening wounds, giving them one last chance to pull me under. I crossed out lines, rewrote them until the paper looked like a battlefield. Margaret brought soup I didn't taste, then left me alone with the silence. At midnight, I stood in the shower water, scalding, trying to wash away the indecision. Sleep came in fits, dreams of locked doors and keys that dissolved in my hand. By dawn, I'd made the decision, or the decision had made me. I packed a small overnight bag, jeans, a sweater, the envelope with Grandma's true will, and drove the 40 minutes to Elm Street. The house looked smaller, the paint peeling in curls, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Evelyn met me at the door, eyes, sunken hair pulled back in a messy knot. She hugged me awkwardly, the scent of stale cigarettes clinging to her clothes. "She's in the living room," she whispered. "Dad's at the pharmacy." The room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Mom lay on the hospital bed, frail under a thin blanket skin, translucent over veins like blue rivers. Her eyes fluttered open when I approached, recognition flickering. "Claire." Her voice was a rasp. "You came." She gestured weakly to the nightstand. A white envelope and a small brass key rested on a crocheted doily. "For you." Everything. I took the envelope, the paper soft with age. Inside was a single sheet in Mom's handwriting, shaky but legible. "Claire. I was wrong. About everything. The safe holds the truth. Forgive me if you can. If not, understand. Love, Mom." I folded it carefully, slipped it into my pocket. The key was cold, heavy. Evelyn hovered in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "She's been asking for you every hour," she said. Said the safe would explain. Mom's breathing hitched, then steadied. I sat on the edge of the bed, took her hand. It was paper-thin bones, sharp under my fingers. "I'm here," I said. She squeezed once weakly, then slipped into sleep. I stayed until the hospice nurse arrived, then followed Evelyn upstairs to the attic. The space was unchanged. Dust motes dancing in the slanted light boxes labeled in Grandma's neat script. The blue quilt lay folded on a cedar chest, the colors faded but the stitches still tight. I lifted it, heart pounding, and there was the safe. Small black combination lock. The key fit the tiny lock beside the dial. I turned it, heard the click, and opened the door. Inside were documents stacked neatly, birth certificates, marriage licenses, a manila folder labeled private. I pulled the folder first. On top was a paternity test dated the year I was born. 2 names, Robert Thompson and Claire Marie Thompson. Probability of paternity 0.00%. My breath caught. Beneath it, a letter in a man's handwriting addressed to Mom. "Barbara. I can't do this anymore. She's pregnant. I'll send money, but I'm gone. I'm sorry." The signature was illegible, but the return address was a P.O. box in Cleveland. More papers, hospital bills for a woman named Linda Carter, a death certificate for an infant boy, a custody agreement giving Mom full rights to a child named Claire Marie Carter, later amended to Thompson. I sat back on my heels, the attic spinning. Evelyn stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. "What is it?" she asked, voice small. I turned the paternity test toward her. Her eyes widened, then filled. "You're not..." She couldn't finish. The pieces clicked into place. Mom's jealousy, the favoritism, the punishment. Not for Dad's affair, but for the child he'd never claimed. I was the secret, the reminder, the living proof of a life she'd tried to erase. And that's when I realized. My mother's revenge wasn't against me. The attic air pressed thick with dust and the faint scent of cedar, but the realization hit colder than any draft. My mother's revenge wasn't against me. I knelt on the worn floorboards, the paternity test trembling in my hand, the 0.00% probability staring back like a verdict. Evelyn hovered behind me, her shadow stretching across the open safe, her breathing shallow and uneven. I set the test aside and reached deeper into the folder, fingers brushing more papers, each one a landmine waiting to detonate. The next document was Evelyn's birth certificate, the original sealed in plastic. Father unknown, Mother Barbara Jean Carter. Date of birth, March 12, 1985. I flipped it over. On the back, in Mom's early handwriting, a note. Changed to Thompson, 1986. Adoption finalized. The adoption decree followed, stamped by the county court listing Robert Thompson as adoptive father, consent signed 6 months after Evelyn's birth. A second paternity test, this one for Evelyn and Dad, dated 1990, showed 0.00% again. 40 years hidden, a secret buried so deep, even Evelyn didn't know. I turned to her, the certificate extended. Her eyes scanned the lines, widened, then filled with something between horror and recognition. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not... Dad is..." Her voice broke. She sank onto the cedar chest, the blue quilt crumpling beneath her. "All this time I was the favorite because you weren't his." I finished the words, tasting like ash. The safe still held more. I pulled out a spiral notebook, pages yellowed, filled with Mom's meticulous lists. Hospital bills, lawyer fees, hush money sent to a Cleveland address. Entries dated back to 1984, the year before Evelyn's birth. Payments to a woman named Linda Carter. The same name on my own custody papers. A letter clipped to the last page in Mom's hand, addressed to no one. I took Claire to protect her. I took Evelyn to protect myself. The guilt never left. The pieces locked together with a sickening click. Mom's affair in her early 20s before Dad, before marriage. Evelyn, the result hidden from the world, then from Dad himself. When he married Mom, he adopted Evelyn without question, raised her as his own. But the guilt festered. Every time Evelyn stumbled, failed a class, lost a job, needed bailing out, Mom saw her own sin reflected back. Favoritism wasn't love. It was penance. Every dollar funneled to Evelyn, every opportunity I was denied, was Mom trying to balance a scale only she could see. I dug deeper. My own birth certificate original listed Father Robert Allen Thompson. No amendments, no changes. A second test run secretly in 2005 when I was 21 confirmed 99.98% probability. Dad's affair, the one Mom had hinted at in the kitchen, had produced me. The letters in the safe, from Dad to a woman named Susan Reed, were tender, desperate ending with a final plea: "I can't leave, Barbara. Claire stays with us. I'll provide, but quietly. The inheritance, promise, Grandma's will, the house. All meant for Dad's biological child, the one he'd fought to keep in the family." Evelyn's sobs broke the silence. "She lied to me my whole life," she said, voice raw. "Made me think I was special because I was his. But I was the mistake she covered up." She clutched the adoption decree, knuckles white. "And you were the one he wanted." I sat back on my heels, the attic spinning. The jealousy Mom confessed to wasn't about Dad's attention. It was about legitimacy. I was the child he'd chosen, the one Grandma had seen as the true heir. Mom's retaliation wasn't against me for existing. It was against the truth I represented. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar stolen, every rewritten will. Atonement for her own deception, paid for with my future. The safe's final item was a small velvet pouch. Inside, a gold locket engraved with a C. Grandma's, the one she'd worn every Sunday. A note tucked inside. For Claire, the daughter I claimed. The weight of it anchored me. Evelyn watched, tears streaming, but I felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow clarity. The story I'd told myself, overlooked daughter, family ATM, was only half the truth. The other half was a 40-year lie built on guilt and fear, crumbling now under the weight of paper and ink. I closed the safe, the click echoing like a door ceiling. Evelyn reached for me, but I stepped back. "I need air," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside. I carried the documents downstairs, past Mom's sleeping form, out to the porch, where the autumn wind whipped the leaves into spirals. The revelations redefined everything: the house, the money, the decades of imbalance. Mom hadn't stolen from me out of spite. She'd used me to quiet her own conscience. She didn't steal from me. She paid for her sins with my money. The wind off the porch carried the bite of coming frost, but the words still burned hotter than any autumn chill. She didn't steal from me. She paid for her sins with my money. I stood there clutching the velvet pouch with Grandma's locket, the safe's contents folded inside my jacket, every secret now heavier than the house itself. Evelyn's sobs drifted from the attic like a distant radio, but I couldn't go back inside, not yet. I drove to Margaret's with the windows cracked, letting the cold scour the haze from my mind. When I walked through her door, she took one look at the envelope trembling in my hand and led me to the dining table where Harold waited, sleeves rolled, legal pads already open like surgical trays. He listened without interruption while I laid the documents in order. Evelyn's original birth certificate, the adoption decree, my confirmed paternity. The locket note. When I finished, the room was silent except for the tick of the wall clock. Harold removed his glasses, cleaned them with the same deliberate motion he'd used the first day we met. "This changes the probate challenge," he said. "The forged will was fraud, yes, but now we have motive. Undue influence rooted in concealing paternity and adoption. The house reverts to you by operation of law." He slid a motion across the table, already drafted petition to set aside probate and quiet title. "We file at 9 tomorrow. The bank unfreezes your credit simultaneously. All fraudulent debts discharge." I signed where he indicated the pen steady. The next morning, the courthouse lobby smelled of floor wax and burnt coffee, same as always, but the clerk's eyes widened when Harold presented the originals. By noon, the judge signed the order ex parte. No hearing required. The forged will was voided. Grandma's true testament recorded the Elm Street house titled solely to Claire Marie Thompson. The bank issued a letter of exoneration, every loan, every lien, every late fee erased from my record as if they'd never existed. My credit score, once bruised black and blue, reset to pristine. Harold texted a single emoji-free line. Clean slate. The apologies began that afternoon. Evelyn called, first voice raw from crying or screaming, I couldn't tell. "Claire, I didn't know about any of it. Please, can we talk?" I agreed to meet at the neutral ground of the downtown library, the same corral where I'd first seen the casino receipts. She arrived 20 minutes late, hair unwashed, wearing yesterday's clothes. She slid into the chair opposite, hands twisting a tissue into knots. "I'm sorry," she blurted before I could speak. "For everything. The money, the lies, the way I treated you. I thought I was the real daughter. Turns out I was the cover story." Tears spilled, genuine but useless. "Forgive me. I'll do anything." I listened, face neutral, the way I'd learned to chart vitals without flinching. When she finished, I slid a copy of the quiet title order across the table. "The house is mine. The debts are gone. That's the end of it." She reached for my hand. I pulled back. "Forgiveness isn't a transaction, Evelyn. It's not mine to give today." I stood, shouldered my bag, and left her staring at the papers. Dad came next, unannounced, knocking on Margaret's door at dusk. He stood on the porch in his old work boots, cap in hand, looking every year of his 65. Margaret let him in, but stayed in the kitchen, giving us the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, staring at the carpet. "I should have told you," he said finally. "About the affair, about signing the adoption papers. Your mother. She was scared. I was weak." His voice cracked. "You were always mine, Claire. Blood don't lie." He looked up, eyes red. "I'm proud of the woman you became. Despite us." I nodded, once the acknowledgement all I could manage. He waited for more, but I offered none. After a minute, he stood, placed his cap back on, and left without another word. The silence he carried out with him was the same one he'd carried in for decades. Mom's turn came from the hospital bed, transferred there when hospice could no longer manage her pain. I visited alone the corridor, sterile and quiet. She was propped against pillows, forward, dripping morphine, skin yellowed and paper thin. When she saw me, her eyes filled. "Claire." The word was barely a breath. "I kept the secrets to protect you both. Failed at that." She gestured to the bedside table where a nurse had placed the locket. Yours by right. Her hand found mine cold and fragile. I'm sorry. For the lies, the theft, the years I made you pay for my mistakes. I let her hold my hand, felt the tremor in her fingers. I know now, I said. About Evelyn, about me, about everything. Her eyes searched mine, pleading. The house is mine. The debts are gone. That's justice. She nodded, tears slipping into the pillow. I'm not suing, I continued. No criminal charges, no civil claims. The truth did its work. Her grip tightened, then released as the morphine pulled her under. I chose Mercy in Harold's office the next day. The police report stayed filed. Forgery and identity theft would proceed without my testimony. The probate fraud would stand as civil resolved by the quiet title. I signed the dismissal of any personal claims, the pen scratching across the page like a period at the end of a long sentence. Harold raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Margaret drove me to the county recorder where I accepted the new deed in my name alone. The clerk handed it over with a smile that didn't quite hide her curiosity. I folded it into my purse beside Grandma's locket and walked out into sunlight that felt warmer than any I remembered. I departed permanently that week. I packed the few things I wanted from Elm Street. Grandma's recipe cards, the blue quilt, a photo of her holding me at age 3, and left the key on the kitchen counter with a note. House is yours to sell or rent. Proceeds to hospice in Mom's name. I blocked every number, changed my own, and moved into a small apartment 3 towns over, close enough for work, far enough for peace. The last image I carried was Mom's face in the hospital, eyes closed, the apology accepted, but not absolved. Mercy doesn't mean forgetting. It means ending it with grace. The phrase lingered in the quiet of my new apartment, a small 1-bedroom above a bakery where the scent of yeast and cinnamon drifted up each morning. Mercy doesn't mean forgetting. It means ending it with grace. I repeated it while unpacking the last box, the blue quilt folded neatly on the couch, Grandma's locket on the windowsill, catching the afternoon light. The walls were bare, but the space felt like breathing room after years of holding my breath. I took a week off from the hospital, using the time to settle, to walk the nearby park, to let the silence teach me what noise never could. One Saturday in late spring, I drove back to Elm Street with a trunk full of soil and seedlings. The house stood empty, the investors for sale sign leaning crooked in the yard. I'd kept the key not out of sentiment, but practicality. The garden had been Mom's once before neglect turned it to weeds. I parked in the driveway, the gravel crunching under tires like old bones. The backyard gate hung open, hinges rusted. I stepped through the air thick with dandelions and the faint sweetness of overgrown mint. The garden beds were a battlefield of thistles and crabgrass. The trellis collapsed under morning glory vines. Mom had planted here every year. Roses along the fence, tomatoes in neat rows, herbs in terracotta pots that now lay cracked on the patio. I rolled up my sleeves, the sun warm on my shoulders in the breeze. I pulled weeds by hand, the roots stubborn but yielding each tug a small ecstasy. The soil was rich beneath the debris, dark and loamy the way Grandma had taught us to turn it every fall. I hauled bags of compost from the car, spread them like forgiveness, then raked the beds smooth. I planted with intention heirloom tomatoes for continuity, basil for scent, marigolds to ward off pests the way Mom used to swear they did. The rose bushes were salvageable. I pruned the dead canes, tied the survivors to new stakes, their thorns drawing blood. I wiped on my jeans without flinching. By noon, sweat soaked my shirt, but the beds took shape, green shoots pushing through the earth like tentative promises. I watered from the hose, the spray catching rainbows in the light, and sat on the back step with a bottle of water watching bees discover the mint. The letter arrived the following week, forwarded from my old P.O. box to the new address. The envelope was thin, the handwriting frail but unmistakable. I opened it in the bakery's courtyard, the smell of fresh bread grounding me. Claire, it began. I'm gone by the time you read this. The doctors gave me days, but the truth gave me peace. You became the woman I never could. Strong enough to walk away, kind enough to leave the door unlocked behind you. I planted that garden with guilt in every seed. You revived it with grace. Thank you for letting me go. Love always, Mom. I read it twice, the paper trembling in the breeze. The words weren't absolution. They were acknowledgement, the first time she'd seen me clearly. I folded the letter, slipped it into my pocket, and drove back to the house. The garden had grown in the week. Tomato plants stretching toward the sun, basil unfurling fragrant leaves. I knelt among the rows, fingers in the dirt, and felt the first crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. The tears came without warning, hot and sudden, spilling onto the soil. I didn't fight them. They weren't the sharp sobs of betrayal or the choked gasps of abandonment. They were softer, deeper, born from a place I hadn't known existed. I wept for the mother who'd carried guilt like a second skin, for the garden she'd tended as penance for the daughter I'd been, who'd believed herself unworthy. I wept for the empathy that had survived every slight, every theft, every lie. The marigolds blurred, the roses swayed, and I let the earth absorb what I could no longer carry. When the storm passed, I wiped my face with the hem of my shirt, the fabric damp and earthy. The garden looked brighter, the colors sharper, as if the tears had washed the lens. I stood, brushed soil from my knees, and walked the rows one last time, touching leaves, inhaling the sharp tang of tomato vines. The act of revival wasn't for Mom. Not really. It was for the part of me that had learned to grow despite being overshadowed. I left the hose coiled neatly by the spigot, the gate latched behind me, and drove away without looking back. Back in my apartment, I hung Grandma's locket on a nail above the kitchen window, the gold catching the morning light like a small sun. The garden would thrive or fade on its own, now a living testament to what could be reclaimed. I returned to work, to 12-hour shifts and patients who needed more than I could give, but I carried the dirt under my nails like a badge. The letter stayed in my bedside drawer, reread on quiet nights when doubt crept in. Mom's words had become a mirror, reflecting not her failures, but my strength. The catharsis settled slowly like sediment in still water. I no longer flinched at family photos in the hospital lobby, no longer braced for the old ache when someone mentioned sisters or mothers. The empathy I'd discovered wasn't weakness. It was the root system that had kept me upright through every storm. I watered my own small balcony pots, now basil and cherry tomatoes in terracotta, their leaves brushing my fingers each morning. The growth was mine, earned through pruning and patience. One evening, months later, I stood at the window watching the sunset paint the bakery roof gold. The locket glinted. The plants thrived. The letter's words echoed softly. For the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. The sensation of no longer being the forgotten daughter carried me through the seasons like a quiet current, steady and unremarkable, until it became the new normal. 1 year later, on a Thursday in late May, I came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find a thick cream envelope wedged in my mailbox, the return address embossed in crisp black: Jenkins and Associates, Attorneys at Law. My pulse quickened. Harold had retired 6 months earlier, his final act transferring Grandma's restored estate to a trust in my name alone. I carried the envelope upstairs, the bakery's warm bread scent following me, and set it on the kitchen counter beside the basil plant that now spilled over its pot. I sliced it open with the butter knife, expecting tax documents or a final accounting. Instead, a single cashier's check slid out, drawn on a bank I didn't recognize, made payable to Claire Marie Thompson in the exact amount of $5,000. No stubs, no explanations, just the check and a small folded note on heavy stock. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted, and deliberate. Use it to forgive yourself, not me. No signature, only a faint impression where a seal had once been pressed. I stood there in the soft evening light, the check cool between my fingers, the note's words looping in my mind. Forgive yourself. The phrase felt like a riddle wrapped in mercy. I thought of the $5,000 demanded at that first dinner, the savings I'd scraped together over years of skipped lunches and double shifts. I thought of the garden I'd revived, the mercy I'd extended, the life I'd built on the other side of betrayal. The money was the same amount, but it wasn't the same currency. It was possibility, not obligation. I called Harold's old office out of habit, but the receptionist confirmed he was on a fishing trip in Canada. I texted Margaret instead, attaching a photo of the check and note. Her reply came within minutes. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m. My house. Bring coffee. I slept fitfully, the envelope on my nightstand like a small moon casting shadows across the quilt. Margaret greeted me at the door with the same calm she'd shown the night I detonated, only now her eyes held a spark of mischief. She led me to the dining table where the banker's box had once lived, now replaced by a single manila folder and 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She slid the folder toward me. Open it. Inside was a trust agreement dated 15 years earlier, executed the same week Grandma added my name to her small savings account at the bank. The trustee, Margaret Hollis. The beneficiary, Claire Marie Thompson, upon attaining age 38, or upon the settler's death, whichever came later. The principal, $5,000 invested conservatively in municipal bonds. A second page detailed annual statements. The balance had grown modestly with interest, then sat untouched after Grandma's passing, hidden behind layers of probate and forgery. Margaret had kept it secret, waiting for the dust to settle, for the legal storm to pass, for me to stand steady on my own. I was instructed to deliver it 1 year after resolution, she said, sipping her coffee. Your grandmother knew what Barbara was capable of. She wanted you to have a clean start, no strings, no guilt. She tapped the note. The message is hers, written the day she signed the trust. She guessed you'd need reminding that the money was never the point. I traced the signature at the bottom, Grandma's loops and crosses as familiar as my own heartbeat. The check suddenly made sense. Not restitution from Mom, not penance from Evelyn, but a gift preserved through chaos. $5,000, the exact amount stolen, now returned with the quiet dignity of compound interest and unwavering faith. I drove to the women's shelter downtown that afternoon, the one I'd volunteered at during nursing school. The director, a former patient named Rosa, met me in the lobby, her smile tired but genuine. I handed her the check and a printed donation form. For the Financial Recovery Fund, I said. Specifically for women rebuilding after family abuse. She read the amount, eyes widening, then pulled me into a hug that smelled of coffee and hope. The money would seed emergency grants, credit repair workshops, first-month rent for apartments that didn't require a co-signer. It would buy bus passes and interview clothes, therapy sessions, and locked mailboxes. It would, in small, measurable ways, restore what had been taken. Rosa walked me out, promising updates, and I stood on the sidewalk watching families come and go. Children clutching new backpacks, mothers carrying folders thick with possibility. The check was gone, but its echo lingered. A ripple moving outward, touching lives I'd never meet. I felt no loss, only expansion. That night I sat on my balcony, the basil brushing my knees, the city lights flickering like low stars. Margaret's revelation had closed the circle. The 5,000 wasn't stolen goods returned. It was a seed planted long ago, nurtured in secret, blooming now in soil I'd prepared myself. Grandma had seen the end from the beginning, trusted Margaret to guard it, trusted me to know what to do when the time came. The note's instruction, forgive yourself, settled into meaning. I'd spent years measuring worth in dollars withheld in love unevenly given. The gift wasn't absolution for them. It was permission for me to stop carrying the deficit. I watered the plants, the droplets catching the porch light, and felt the last knot in my chest loosen. The story had come full circle, not with vengeance or victory, but with generosity that outpaced every theft. They stole my money, but I took back my power, with interest. The scent of fresh basil still clung to my fingers that evening as I closed the balcony door, the city humming softly below. The $5,000 was gone, transformed into hope for women I'd never meet, but the weight of it had lifted something heavier inside me. Grandma's trust. Margaret's quiet guardianship, the note's gentle command to forgive myself. Each piece had woven a safety net I hadn't known I needed. I poured a glass of water, the locket glinting on its nail, and sat at the small kitchen table where I'd once tallied sacrifices in a notebook, now buried in a landfill. The story had ended where it began, with $5,000, but the currency was different, power piece possibility. I thought of the garden on Elm Street, likely sold by now, the tomatoes ripening under someone else's care. I thought of Mom's letter, the one I kept in the drawer with Grandma's, both fragile bridges to women who'd tried in their broken ways to reach me. I thought of Evelyn's, somewhere in a studio apartment, learning to stand without the crutch of favoritism. And Dad's, silent as ever, perhaps finally speaking his own truths to an empty room. The legal storm had passed, the debts erased, the house reclaimed, the secrets laid bare. I'd chosen mercy, not out of weakness, but because carrying their chaos any longer would have dimmed the light I'd fought to